the introduction. Oh, all right. Thanks very much for the introduction, Lisa. And hello, everyone. It's lovely to meet you. So yeah, this first session is going to be focused on techniques for forecasting distributed energy resources from the perspective of grid planning. But before we dive in, I'd like you to take a moment to think about a recent forecast that you either worked with or reviewed or was in one of your filings, and ideally one that included some amount of DERs. And I'd like you to keep that forecast in mind as we step through this session. Over the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be sharing a number of prompts and questions on each slide, which should be good for reflection. And my goal is to help you connect with the material that you work on so that you can take away insights that are relevant and directly actionable to you. So without any further ado, let's get started. Next slide, please. I'm going to whiz through two bits of context here. I suspect everyone is familiar with these points, but just to make sure we're all starting from the same place. Load growth is now returning to the US. This is a chart showing electricity end use in the US. And you can see through the 2000s, it's very, very flat in terms of total electricity consumption. In 2024, we saw a 2% year-over-year increase in electricity consumption, and it's forecast to be a 2% increase on that again in 2025 and a 2% increase on that again in 2026. So we're heading into uncertain territory, and this has huge implications for grid planning. Now, in terms of percentage contributions to that load, data centers, which Greg will talk about, and manufacturing account for the lion's share, but DERs are very important as well and important to plan for properly. So next slide, please. Great. So yeah, DERs, what are they? Stands for distributed energy resources. It's things like solar panels, electric vehicles, energy efficiency, batteries, things like that. And DERs tend to be adopted behind the meter. They can be very, very hard for utilities to spot. And although they are small, they can be mighty. They impact all levels of grid planning, whether it be rate design all the way through integrated resource planning. And so we're at a stage now where planning is perhaps more and more important, but the forecasting has become harder and harder to do well. Next slide, please. So when talking about forecasting, it can be helpful to delineate load forecasting from DER forecasting, particularly distributed generation forecasting. As well, there are some important differences here. So starting with load forecasting, it's a bit of a fuzzy term. It encapsulates an awful lot of different things. Broadly speaking, over the past few decades, load forecasts have consisted of econometric models which extend historic trends. So whether doing distribution system planning or bulk power system planning, it has been a reasonable assumption that the past is a good representation of the future. And these sorts of models have been sufficient to support decision-making. Depending on the use case, these sorts of more historic models may have had some percentage load growth baked into them, year-over-year load growth. They may have accounted for weather normalization as well. That's a common, accounting for weather is very, very common in load forecasting. But we're now in a period of rapid change. We're seeing load growth, as we just saw, and rapid DER adoptions. We're seeing changes in climate and weather, which have huge implications to planning. And these traditional forecasting techniques on their own are no longer sufficient. So this is a chart put together by Kaiso that nicely illustrates the differences between gross and net load. And as these differences increase with more distributed generation and more DERs coming online, this has real implications to planning procedures and sort of standard practice for forecasting. So yeah, DERs are causing large changes between the timing and the magnitude of the peak load in a system, which presents a whole host of new challenges, which we'll go through in the next couple of slides. Just to quickly talk on DER forecasting, a lot of utilities, ISOs, RTOs are starting to account for DERs explicitly in their forecasts. However, the sophistication of this modeling varies significantly depending on the available data and the technical proficiency of the people putting the forecasts together, and also varies depending on the use case. So at one end, it may range from just taking one of these historic econometric models, layering in some demand modifiers to account for DERs, or it may consist of the highly granular forecasting of DERs, sort of at the premise level, what's called a technique called bottom-up forecasting, which we may have time to look at a little bit in more detail later on as well. What is consistent across these forecasts is a high utilization of open source models, and we're very, very lucky as a modeling community to have access to a number of very, very high quality tools. I've linked here specifically for distributed generation, DGen and PV Watts, which are put together by NREL. And I've also linked at the bottom here ISO New England as an example, who separately forecast distributed generation and baseload. And so would encourage you to take a look at that if it's a useful resource too. Okay, next slide, please. So on to DERs. In the interest of time, we're only going to have two DERs to talk about today, EVs and heat pumps. Though there are many, many other DERs that are worthy of consideration too. So solar panels, batteries, energy efficiency, and so on. And when forecasting DERs, we care about two things. We care about the adoptions, so where and when are they going to appear on the grid, and behavior. What is their time series load going to look like? And then from both of those, what are the things that we can do to prepare for or mitigate the worst effects of their impacts? So where and when, what will their behavior look like? And what, if anything, can we do about them? And we're going to talk about each of these two in turn. So we'll start with heat pumps. Next slide, please. So we've seen a dramatic uptake in heat pumps in the last couple of years. This is a chart showing heat pump sales versus gas furnaces in the US. And heat pumps have been outselling gas furnaces since about 2020. And in 2024, outsold them by their largest margin ever. This is partly due to their favorable properties. They're incredibly efficient, as we all know, and a lot of the US are now the economic choice. But we're also seeing policy driving uptake. And this is a good point to just pause on. Policy is a great influencer of DER adoptions. We've got at the federal level, all the way through states to local jurisdictions, all adopting sometimes very, very aggressive policies and decarbonization targets. And when working with forecasts for any DER, it's really important to ask the question, what policy scenarios have been accounted for, and how has this been converted into something that is meaningfully reflected in my models, or in the models in the work that you're working with? So what could this look like? Different policies could show up in a number of different ways. It could impact the total quantity of a technology that's adopted. It could impact the rate at which that adoption occurs. It could affect the types of technologies that are adopted, and it could affect the distribution of those technologies and where they pop up. And for example, here, if we were forecasting heat pumps across Colorado, let's say, we would want to make sure that we accounted for all of the policies. And an example one that's a very, very local one is the Comfort 365 program in Boulder, which provides $1,750, I think, if you replace your gas furnace with a heat pump. So this will definitely impact and influence where people decide to adopt certain numbers of heat pumps across the state. I've included some other questions here and prompts for you to consider when working with forecasts that include heat pump adoptions. So what set of technologies are being accounted for? Is it just residential? Is it residential and commercial? Are there cold climate heat pumps? Are there air and ground source? Are we looking at water heating too? And all of this has an impact on not just where the adoptions happen, but behavior too. And talking of behavior, next slide, please. So this is a chart showing some example heat pump behavior. If you look at other sources, you'll see stuff that's fairly consistent with this. When left to their own devices, heat pumps tend to behave fairly consistently. They're very, very responsive to time of day and responsive to external temperature. However, forecasting heat pump behavior can be a very, very tricky exercise. Capturing the specifics of any particular building can be very, very tricky. And there are a few groups who've produced very, very advanced physics-based models which take literally hundreds of inputs, like building size, building materials, building usage patterns, external temperature, even things like wind speed into account. So NREL has a tool called, an open source tool called ResDoc and one called Comstock for residential and commercial heat pump modeling, among other building usage modeling too. And these sorts of models are very, very computationally intensive and can be inaccessible without a strong technical background and capability within your team. So in the case that we don't have the ability to build or use one of these complex physics-based models, there are other strategies for forecasting heat pump behavior too. One strategy I've seen before is to take gas consumption data as a proxy for heating energy usage, and then applying that to some heat pumps that may replace the gas usage. Or taking some sample profile and maybe scaling it up to a territory. But these other techniques start to come with their own issues and start introducing new errors that you need to be careful to account for. So again, if you're working with some forecast and you're presented with some time series of heat pump behavior, even if it's averaged over a larger region, it's really worth asking the question, how has that behavior curve been generated? What were the inputs to that curve or to that model? And more importantly, perhaps, how has this model been validated against real world observations? And if the results in the forecasts that you're working with haven't got particularly clear points to answer those questions, that's certainly a flag that's worth investigating a little bit more closely, because as we'll see in the next slide, the implications could be huge for different technologies. The issues from a grid planning perspective of heat pumps, we can stick on this one, is the concept of, is the concept of this sort of cool instant peaking. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that. This is a study put together by NREL, I think actually using the ResDoc and Comstock tools to compare in Colorado the difference between a standard air source heat pump and a high efficiency cold climate heat pump. And you can see that the two technologies here have a difference in peak of about 30 or 40%. So when looking at an entire system, entire service territory, or even just a feeder, this can make an enormous difference to the planning needs. In terms of mitigating the worst effects of heat pumps, there are lots of things that we can do. Energy efficiency retrofits are some of the lowest hanging fruit, and I'm a big proponent for energy efficiency. There's a lot of excitement around virtual power plants, but they have their own issues. And again, if people are interested, we can talk more about those afterwards. But again, if we're going to then start modeling heat pumps and then modeling mitigation strategies, perhaps to investigate NWAs, non-wires alternatives. On top of that, that introduces a lot of additional complexity to the model, introduces new sources of error, and is something we need to be very, very careful about doing properly. We also need to take into account not just things like energy efficiency VPPs, we need to take into account different weather scenarios. And as we've got a changing climate and a changing weather, we're seeing extreme weather events happen with a greater and greater frequency. And if you, can we go to the next slide as well, please? We're seeing that it consistently, not just across the studies we've done at Kevala, but other research groups too, heat pump adoptions into the future have the capability of shifting the system-wide peak from typically summer to winter, which has enormous implications for grid planning and gas planning as well. So this chart here shows a study that we did with Excel, I believe, and across all the scenarios that we investigated, you can see that the proportion of feeders peaking in winter increases through time consistently. There are some links here to other studies that find similar pieces of information too. And yeah, we can talk more about the effects of weather in a little bit too. Okay, I think that's it for heat pumps. So is the next slide EVs? Yeah, great. Okay, so we'll go into EVs now. Just like with heat pumps, we've seen a dramatic uptake in the number of electric vehicles adopted in the US. In 2024, 1 in 10 light-duty vehicles sold in the US came with some sort of a plug. But it's worth noting that the adoption trends for electric vehicles are very, very uneven. The bulk of adoptions are happening on the coasts and a few other pockets across the US. And just to put a number on it, we have about 4.5 million electric vehicles on the road at the moment in the US, out of a total population of vehicles of about 280 million. So very, very much in the early days of adoption still. Some estimates think that we'll have closer to 100 million by the mid-2030s, 100 million EVs by the mid-2030s. So maybe at the start of this big hockey stick, and that introduces a lot of complexity. And this is a problem for no other reason than the electric grid was simply never designed to be the fuel source for transportation in the US. And it's worth also noting that this trend is not just isolated to light-duty vehicles, but also trucking and buses. So Amazon has started electrifying their fleets of delivery vehicles. School buses are going electric as well. Oakland recently electrified, I think, all of the school buses in the region with vehicle-to-grid integration. And there's a challenge that's unique to EVs. It's not just the load growth itself, but the mobility of this load growth. So it's one thing to forecast that existing customers are going to consume more electricity. It's another challenge entirely to forecast what this load will look like and when and where it appears, particularly if that load is movable. And forecasters and regulators have historically thought of EVs in terms of the total number of vehicles that are going to be adopted. And we need to start thinking in terms of charges and thinking in terms of profiles. As with heat pumps, electric vehicle adoptions are highly policy dependent. This must be accounted for when we're forecasting. A number of states have adopted something called ACC2, or the Advanced Clean Cars Act, or regulations. And this targets having 100% of new vehicle sales being zero emissions by 2035. And these are the states where we're seeing that concentrated set of electric vehicle adoptions. I think California, Washington, and Colorado are closer to 25% of their light-duty vehicle sales being electric, rather than the 10% average across the states. And as before, on the other slides, we have a set of questions here to work with when looking at electric vehicle forecasts in the reports that we all work with. But particularly important here, what set of EVs and EVSE are being forecast? Is it just personal vehicles, or is it everything? And if it's everything, how are the proportions of different EVs and EVSE being determined? For the same amount of energy delivered, a higher proportion of level 2 chargers compared to DC fast chargers is going to have enormous impacts on the peakiness, the spikiness of the electric vehicle load in a given region. So important to understand where those assumptions have come from. Great. Next slide, please. So at Kevala, we like to break things into 3 use cases: personal vehicles, fleet vehicles, and public workplace and corridor charging. Excuse all the lines here. These are to do with different scenarios when we were forecasting for a different project. But generally speaking, personal vehicles tend to charge when they get back from work in the later afternoon and early evening. Generally speaking, fleet vehicles charge a little bit later than that, but it's worth pointing out that fleet vehicles are particularly, or I should say fleets as a whole, are particularly challenging to model. There is no one-size-fits-all use case. A school bus fleet will charge very, very differently to a fleet of delivery vehicles, and even 2 sets of delivery vehicles or some other similar fleet may exhibit very, very different charging behavior depending on their location and how they're used. And then just to round out, PWC charging, public workplace and corridor charging, tends to be smoother throughout the daytime. However, just like heat pumps, there are things that we can do to affect the shape of this load. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept of managed charging programs. And when working with forecasts, it's worth asking what types of behavior have been considered. Is this a fully unmanaged scenario where vehicles are left to charge on their own devices, left to their own devices to charge whenever they like? Is there some incentive to charge at a different time of the day? If that's the case, how has that incentive been accounted for? What incentive are you trying to provide? Asking all of these questions and making sure that the assumptions are watertight. 4 minutes remaining. Okay, we will whiz through. Next slide, please. Let's just keep going. So here are 2 example studies, one by PJM, one by RMI, looking at different EVSE behavior for different regions. This is not an apples to apples comparison, but just to illustrate that different forecasts can generate very different looking results for what system-wide EV behavior is going to look like. I'll leave you to click onto those links and look at those in closer detail. Next slide, please. With respect to mitigation strategies, this is another thing that I would encourage you to read if you're working a lot with electric vehicles. Time of use rates encourage people to charge at different times in the day to avoid peaking the grid when it's most stressed. This is a study put together by Energy Hub that shows something called a snapback peak, where lots of people have adopted the time of use rate, but actually people will start charging off of software that automatically kicks in when the time of use rate kicks in, and this can cause a secondary peak that's worse than the peak you're trying to avoid in the first place. This may or may not be a problem depending on the needs of your system. I believe this is off of real world data. This is not just some modeling result. But again, it's more complicated than it might seem. And if you're looking at modeled results, again, asking how have the assumptions been formed, what are you taking into account, and so forth. Next slide, please. So just one more point here on EVs. The impact of temperature is really, really important for most DERs, but particularly electric vehicles. And this is something I often see overlooked when working with other forecasts. This is a study put together by Geotab, and again, I'd encourage you to read it. It looks at 4.5 million trips across a few thousand EVs, and they pulled out this curve that plots EV performance against temperature. And you can see from standard conditions to very, very cold conditions, going the same amount of distance, an electric vehicle consumes up to twice the amount of energy. This is largely because it needs to keep the cabin that the person is driving in the same, a comfortable temperature, and it also needs to do some heating on the battery too. And taking this into account can really change the results of the forecast. And as I say, it's not common that people explicitly account for temperature with EV forecasts. Okay, so 2 minutes left. Next slide, please. I've prepared 3 pillars of sort of best practices for DER planning. I'm sure that we could come up with 10 pillars, but I think that these are the 3 sort of core pieces that if you take away anything, that this is what I'd like you to sort of take. So the first is accounting for the localized effects, granular forecasting, accounting for the localized effects of DER adoptions. We know that DER adoptions, at least in the next couple of years, are going to be clustered rather than evenly spread. And even for a few adoptions, a small number of adoptions, they can have massive impacts on local infrastructure. So some examples at the bottom there are some highly granular localized bottom-up forecasts that do a really great job capturing that effects and justifying their methodologies. The second pillar, data access, we need to use really high quality data to do this. Data is critical both for developing forecasts and for validating other people's work. And there are some examples of some really great open source data tools there. It's not uncommon to read in grid plans and research papers that the data that was used and the methodologies that were used are proprietary and hidden behind some screen. This is not good practice and slows down regulatory proceedings. So we need to be as transparent as possible. There are legitimate concerns with data access, if something is really sensitive, but particularly for methodologies, there's no reason that this should be hidden behind, a curtain. And then the last pillar here, scenario and probabilistic analyses. We are in a situation now where we need to assess a range of plausible future conditions. It's not uncommon in the past for decisions to be made off of a single point forecast, particularly for distribution system planning. And as we head into a much more uncertain future, being able to quantify the uncertainty on the figures we're using to make decisions really helps improve the confidence and the robustness of the decision-making process that we've got. And I've got some examples there as well of people who have done great work with scenario and probabilistic-based analyses. I think I'm out of time. There are 2 more slides here describing the process for bottom-up forecasting. Happy to talk about this more later on in the session or offline if you'd like to send me an email. So I won't go through this. There's this slide, and there's another one after this that shows specifically how DER forecasting works. And then after this, we've got some recommendations that states can take and PUCs and SEOs, and then some questions that you can ask as well when interacting with forecasters on the next slide as well. But that's me for time. I'm happy to take questions and do my best to answer them, but thank you very much.
Chris, that was fantastic. Thank you. And please take a breath.